On the morning of June 7, 2026, Russian forces along the eastern Donetsk axis began moving in a formation that Ukrainian forward observation posts had not recorded since the opening weeks of the spring campaign. 5 reinforced battalion tactical groups, supported by the largest single Russian artillery preparation of the past 4 months, pushed forward simultaneously across an 18-kilometer front in what Russian Operational Command had designated Operation Iron Meridian, the most ambitious single-axis ground assault Russia had attempted since the failed elite formation commitment of May 24. The preparation had been in planning for 3 weeks. The force package had been assembled from reconstituted units drawn from 4 separate reserve pools across the eastern military district. The artillery grouping supporting the assault represented the largest concentration of Russian tube artillery on any single axis since February 2026, assembled at significant cost to adjacent sectors that had been quietly stripped of fire support assets to resource the operation. Moscow had decided that after weeks of catastrophic operational reverses, the Southern Front unraveling, the Volga system breach, the deep strike sequence against its most protected facilities, it needed a visible, large-scale ground success to demonstrate that Russian offensive capacity remained intact, and that the narrative of cascading failure could be interrupted by a decisive show of force. By 14 o'clock the same day, all 5 battalion tactical groups had been halted. 2 had been combat ineffective, and the largest Russian attack in months had been turned into the most complete single-day operational disaster of the spring campaign. Ukraine had not simply stopped the assault. It had dismantled it, systematically, in real time, using a fires and drone architecture that Russian planning had assessed as insufficient to defeat a force package of this scale. The largest attack in months had produced the largest single-day Russian loss in months. And the chaos it generated was not accidental. It had been engineered, prepared, and waiting. If this is your first time here and you want the analysis that goes beneath the surface of this war, the doctrine, the systems, the real operational picture, hit like and subscribe right now, because this is exactly what this channel is built to deliver. Now let's get into it. The confirmation of what happened on June 7th assembled itself through the layered independent verification architecture that the spring campaign has made familiar. Commercial satellite imagery captured vehicle kill signatures, distributed across the full 18-kilometer assault frontage in a pattern consistent not with a linear defensive engagement but with multiple simultaneous ambush events, the spatial distribution of destroyed vehicles showing clustering at specific terrain, features that matched pre-identified Ukrainian fire concentration zones rather than the random scatter pattern of a force destroyed by reactive defensive fires. Acoustic monitoring data recorded a Ukrainian artillery firing sequence that opened across 6 pre-registered fire zones within a 90-second window of Russian forces crossing their line of departure, a coordination signature that requires pre-planned fire mission data, pre-positioned ammunition, and rehearsed execution protocols, none of which can be improvised in the time available between detection and response, and intercepts of Russian command communications, reviewed by Ukrainian military intelligence, and summarized in briefings, shared with European defense partners, recorded a command response sequence that began with assault-in-progress reports, transitioned to heavy contact and fire support requests within 40 minutes, and reached communications loss and no-status transmissions from 2 of the 5 battalion tactical groups before the 3rd hour of the operation had elapsed. Russian Operational Command had launched its largest attack in months. Ukrainian operational planning had been ready for it for 19 days, but the systematic dismantling of 5 Russian battalion tactical groups in a single afternoon was not the real story. The real story was 19 days. 19 days was how far in advance Ukrainian military intelligence had detected the assembly of Operation Iron Meridian, the full force package, the artillery grouping, the assault corridors, the operational timeline, and had used that window to construct a defensive and fires architecture so precisely calibrated to the specific assault geometry that what Russian commanders experienced on June 7th was not a defensive battle. It was a pre-built machine that had been designed to their exact operational specifications and was waiting for them to walk into it. To understand how Ukraine achieved 19 days of advance warning against an operation that Russian planning had specifically designed to compress the detection window, you first need to understand a Russian operational security failure that occurred at the planning stage, in that Ukrainian signals intelligence identified within 72 hours of the planning process beginning. To understand what Ukraine did to Operation Iron Meridian, you first need to understand the specific intelligence breakthrough that gave Ukraine its 19-day window. Russian operational planners, drawing on the painful lessons of the spring campaign's intelligence failures, had implemented a new operational security protocol for Iron Meridian that represented a genuine improvement over previous practice. Communications between Army headquarters and the assembling battalion tactical groups were maintained at normalized volume levels through the traffic normalization protocol that had been introduced in early May. Force movements were conducted under electronic emissions suppression. Artillery positioning was conducted in dispersed increments over an extended period, rather than in the concentrated movement that had previously generated detectable CART pre-assault signatures. By the metrics that Russian operational security was measuring, the assembly of Iron Meridian was the most concealed major force preparation Russia had attempted in the spring campaign. The failure was not in what Russian operational security was measuring, it was in what it was not measuring. Ukrainian signals intelligence, building on the signals architecture intelligence collected during the communications security upgrade distribution of early May, had developed a secondary collection methodology that did not monitor communications content or volume, but monitored the power consumption signatures of the encrypted communications terminals themselves. Different operational tempos, routine garrison activity versus active planning and coordination, generate different power consumption profiles in the terminal hardware, profiles that are detectable at ranges sufficient for Ukrainian collection assets to observe without being within range of Russian electronic warfare countermeasures. The normalized communications volume concealed the planning activity from content and volume analysis. The power consumption signature revealed it to the collection method Russian operational security had not modeled as a threat. Within 72 hours of Iron Meridian planning beginning, Ukrainian signals intelligence had identified the terminal clusters generating elevated power consumption signatures, geolocated them to the headquarters elements of the assembling force package, and begun the targeting development process that would produce the June 7th defensive architecture. 19 days later, the machine was ready. The pre-registered fire zone that opened against the 3rd Battalion Tactical Group's assault corridor within 40 seconds of its forces crossing the line of departure is the detail that crystallizes everything about how completely Ukraine's 19-day preparation had anticipated the specific geometry of Russian assault planning. Pre-registered fire zones are positioned based on predictions of where an attacking force will be at specific points in its assault sequence. Getting those predictions right requires knowing not just the general axis of advance, but the specific timing, the specific approach routes, and the specific terrain features at which Russian assault doctrine calls for. Formations and movements. The fire zone that engaged the 3rd Battalion Tactical Group was positioned at the exact terrain feature, a shallow depression 4 kilometers inside the Ukrainian defensive line that Russian assault planning had designated as a consolidation point for the second assault wave that Russian commanders had selected because previous Ukrainian defensive fires had consistently been unable to range it accurately from the established Ukrainian firing positions. Russian planning had specifically routed the 3rd Battalion Tactical Group through that depression because it was, in Russian assessment, a dead ground location outside effective Ukrainian fires coverage. Ukraine had registered new firing positions for that exact location 19 days earlier. The dead ground was no longer dead, and the assault wave that consolidated in it, believing it was in covered terrain, had been registered as a target before a single Russian soldier stepped into it. What looks like Ukrainian tactical precision is actually the product of a 19-day intelligence-to-fires pipeline that had mapped Russian assault planning in sufficient detail to position lethal effects at the specific terrain features Russian planning had identified as safe. The safety was an illusion. Ukraine had built the illusion specifically to be believed. The full arc of how Russia assembled and committed Operation Iron Meridian to the June 7th assault begins in late May 2026, when Russian Operational Command completed a strategic assessment of its options, following the accumulating reverses of the spring campaign that reached a conclusion simultaneously correct in its diagnosis and catastrophic in its prescription. The diagnosis was correct. The narrative of Russian campaign momentum, which had been sustained through the grinding Donetsk advances and the projection of continued offensive capacity, was at risk of collapsing under the weight of the Southern Front unraveling. The Volga system breach, the elite formation losses, and the deep strike sequence. The prescription was catastrophic. That a large-scale visible ground success on the Donetsk axis, achieved through the concentration of reconstituted reserve forces and maximum artillery support, would interrupt the failure narrative and restore sufficient operational momentum to stabilize the information environment around the campaign. The prescription was catastrophic, not because its operational logic was irrational, but because it rested on an assumption that the spring campaign had repeatedly invalidated, that a major Russian force commitment to a planned axis could be assembled and executed before Ukrainian intelligence detected and prepared against it. That assumption had been wrong in April, wrong in May, and wrong again in June, but the political pressure to produce a visible success was, by late May, outweighing the operational judgment that cautioned against committing reconstituted reserves to an operation on an axis where Ukrainian intelligence and fire's performance had been consistently catastrophic for Russian forces. The political decision drove the operational planning. The operational planning drove the force assembly. The force assembly generated the power consumption signatures the Ukrainian signals intelligence detected within 72 hours, and the political imperative that had produced the operation became the mechanism of its destruction. Step back now to the full campaign, because the destruction of Operation Iron Meridian on June 7th completes a pattern that has now repeated itself, with sufficient consistency and at sufficient cost to constitute something more than a series of individual operational failures. Russia has now committed major force packages to planned offensive operations on 5 separate occasions during the spring 2026 campaign: the April 14th Zaporizhzhia counterattack, the May 17th northern Donetsk encirclement attempt, the May 24th elite formation assault northeast of Kramatorsk, the May 25th Southern Reserve gamble, and the June 7th Operation Iron Meridian. On all 5 occasions, Ukrainian intelligence detected the preparation in advance. On all 5 occasions, Ukraine used the detection window to build a defensive and fires architecture specifically calibrated to the assault geometry. On all 5 occasions, the operation culminated with Russian forces suffering losses disproportionate to any ground gained, and with the committing formations requiring extended reconstitution before they could return to active operations. The pattern is not ambiguous. It is the defining operational dynamic of the spring 2026 campaign, and it has not changed despite Russian operational security improvements that have, in each successive operation, been more sophisticated than the last. The April detection exploited communications volume signatures. The May 24th detection exploited communications security upgrade distribution patterns. The June 7th detection exploited terminal power consumption signatures. Each time Russia closed one detection vector, Ukraine found another. The underlying problem, that any major force assembly generates observable signatures across multiple collection domains simultaneously, and that Ukraine's collection architecture is now sophisticated enough to read those signatures faster than Russian operational security can suppress them all, has not been solved by any of the operational security improvements Russia has implemented. It cannot be solved by improving the security of any single collection domain. It requires a fundamental restructuring of how Russia assembles and commits forces for major operations, a restructuring that takes years, not weeks, and that must be executed while the war continues and Ukraine continues to develop new collection methodologies against whatever new procedures Russia introduces. Now come to the arithmetic of what the destruction of Operation Iron Meridian means for Russian offensive capacity on the Donetsk axis through the summer campaign. The 5 battalion tactical groups committed to the June 7th assault were not drawn from Russia's best remaining formations. Those had been destroyed on May 24th. They were drawn from reconstituted units whose combat effectiveness, while assessed by Russian operational planning as sufficient for a supported assault operation, represented the second tier of Russian available force quality after the elite formations were gone. Their destruction on June 7th removes that second tier from immediate operational availability. What remains in the reconstitution pipeline for the Donetsk axis is, according to logistics and manpower assessments cited by RUSI analysts reviewing the spring campaign, a third tier of recently mobilized formations, whose training and completion levels and equipment provision status make them suitable for static defensive operations, but not for the kind of coordinated combined arms assault that Operation Iron Meridian attempted. Russia has not run out of soldiers. It has run out of formations capable of conducting major offensive operations at the standard that even a failed assault requires. The grinding attritional advance that has characterized the Donetsk campaign, the slow, costly forward movement measured in hundreds of meters per week, can continue with third-tier formations, the decisive breakthrough operations that Russian operational planning needs to reverse the strategic momentum of the spring campaign cannot. Russia's offensive capacity on its most active axis has been reduced to a tempo that can sustain the appearance of forward movement but cannot produce the kind of operational result that changes the strategic picture. And the political pressure that produced Operation Iron Meridian, the need for a visible success, has not been relieved by the operation's failure. It has been intensified by it. Moscow now needs a visible success more urgently than it did on June 6th, and it has fewer capable forces with which to attempt one than it had on June 6th. That is not a temporary operational constraint. It is a structural condition that will define Russian offensive options through the remainder of 2026. There is one further dimension of the June 7th disaster that has not received adequate attention in the coverage that followed and that carries significant implications for the coming weeks. The artillery grouping assembled for Operation Iron Meridian, the largest Russian tube artillery concentration on any single axis since February, had been resourced through a stripping operation that reduced fire support availability across 3 adjacent Donetsk sectors to levels that multiple Russian brigade commanders had flagged as insufficient for their defensive assignments. Those flags had been overridden by operational command in order to resource the Iron Meridian preparation. The artillery grouping was not destroyed on June 7th. It was suppressed by Ukrainian counter-battery fires during the assault and partially repositioned to avoid further attrition, but the majority of the pieces remain operational. What is not operational is the propellant supply that was consumed during the 4-month artillery preparation and the June 7th fire mission sequence. According to logistics assessments cited in ISW analysis of the operation, the Iron Meridian artillery grouping consumed approximately 6 weeks of propellant allocation for its sector during the preparation and assault phases, allocation that had been drawn forward from future supply deliveries on the assumption that the operation's success would justify the expenditure. The operation did not succeed. The propellant has been consumed. The 3 adjacent sectors that were stripped of fire support to resource Iron Meridian now face a period of reduced artillery coverage at the same moment that Ukrainian forces, emboldened by the June 7th success and positioned favorably by the Volga system breach, are most likely to probe for exploitation opportunities. Russia has created a fires deficit across a 40-kilometer stretch of its most contested front at the worst possible moment in exchange for an operation that produced no operational gain, consumed formations that cannot be quickly replaced. The cost of the political decision to attempt a visible success has been paid in the currency of future defensive capacity, and that currency is running short. Here is the final strategic reality that the destruction of Russia's largest attack in months illuminates. Operation Iron Meridian was not simply a failed military operation, it was the visible consequence of a decision-making system under political stress, producing operational choices that military judgment operating without that stress, would not have made. The assembly of 5 battalion tactical groups for a major assault on an axis where Ukrainian intelligence and fire's performance had been consistently catastrophic required overriding the operational lessons of 3 previous failures on the same axis in the same campaign season. It required accepting a detection risk that the campaign had demonstrated was not manageable through available operational security measures, and it required consuming reconstituted reserves and propellant stocks that the deteriorating Southern Front situation made irreplaceable in the near term. None of those decisions were operationally sound. All of them were politically driven by the need to produce a result that interrupted the failure narrative, by the pressure from a leadership that was reading the strategic situation in terms of information management rather than operational reality, and by a planning culture that had not yet fully internalized the degree to which Ukrainian intelligence had penetrated the operational security of every major Russian force assembly since March. The result was an operation that produced exactly the outcome that sound operational judgment would have predicted. And that political pressure overrode the old assumption that political necessity could be converted into operational success through sufficient force concentration and artillery preparation, has been replaced by a strategic reality in which political necessity and operational sound judgment are pointing in opposite directions, and the attempts to bridge that gap through force are producing the most expensive failures of the campaign. What remains is a Russian military that is fighting a war its operational capacity can no longer support at the tempo its political leadership requires, and a Ukrainian military that has learned, with remarkable consistency across the spring of 2026, exactly how to turn the gap between those two realities into chaos. What do you think this comes down to? Does the destruction of Operation Iron Meridian, combined with the propellant deficit it has created across adjacent Donetsk sectors, and the exhaustion of Russia's second-tier offensive formations, represent the point at which the gap between Russian political requirements and operational capacity becomes unbridgeable, forcing either a fundamental change in Russian strategic objectives or an acceleration toward the negotiated resolution that the spring campaign's cumulative damage has been making increasingly unavoidable? Or does Russia retain sufficient mobilization depth and industrial output to reconstitute its offensive capacity through the summer and attempt again in the autumn, regardless of the cost the spring has imposed? Tell me in the comments, and if this channel is where you come for the real analysis, the systems, the doctrine, the operational picture beneath the daily headlines, make sure you are subscribed, because the story unfolding here is approaching the moment that will define how this war ends.